Hi, Lorissa.
Hi.
Oh my gosh. I actually feel really teary and emotional because this is really a big deal for me. I'm fangirling a little bit.
I
I
feel like this is a
absolutely,
big deal for me. I fangirl on you all the time on Instagram. I'm like, ooh, I love this. Share, share, share.
oh, it's so mutual admiration society, right?
Absolutely.
Oh my gosh, what an absolute thrill. Well, I mean, I'm gonna just jump right in. We are here, you and me, we're here for Dickey today.
Yes.
This amazing woman who I am actually at this point so emotionally attached to Dickey Chapelle through your book that I might not make it through this Zoom call without crying.
Okay.
I have so many questions that I want to ask you and so many things that I want to share about, my observations of Dickey and of you now following you on social media for, I don't know, like a year and a half or so.
Yeah,
The second I,
we've been connected for a while. Yeah.
yeah, the second I found out about this book, and I don't remember how, but I just remember going like, what is this? Who is this woman who's writing about this woman? I need to find them. And here we are.
Yeah.
So I don't even know where to start. I want to dive right in and get to the meat of why, for me, Dickey has completely changed my life, and therefore you writing for Dickey and about Dickey have had such an impact on my life. There's a passage at the beginning of your book that I'd like to start with. Are you okay if we do that? If I dive in?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. So this is in Larissa's introduction, by the way, first to the front, the untold story of Dickey Chapelle, who is truly one of my favorite women ever. So here we go. And this is why I think everybody watching is going to love Dickey as well, and your book. By every right, Dickey Chapelle should be a household name. Throughout her career, which spanned the length and breadth of the early Cold War, Dickey's capacity to march beside fighting men, regardless of creed or color, made her insights singular. Her commitment to human rights, equality, and social justice made her reporting invaluable. The stories she brought back from the last days of World War II to the first days of the Vietnam War continue to shed new light on the evolution and history of the Cold War. This is the part. Yet, while she was alive and after she died as the first American female journalist to be killed in combat, Dickey's fellow journalists dismissed her uncomfortable relevance. They accused her of being obsessed with military life, of being overly consumed by her career, and of being incapable of objectivity. For decades, their arrows stuck, relegating her to obscurity. But it was precisely the criticisms leveled against her that made her such an extraordinary reporter then and such a relevant voice now.
Yeah. So thank you for reading that. And it's been a while since the book has come out and even longer since I've written it. So hearing that again, was really powerful for me as well. And I'll just start by saying I wrote this book, or rather, in writing this book, I was so moved and changed as well by Dickey's story. And she, I think I'll approach it this way. When she was reporting, objectivity was basically the white male point of view. She took the point of view of the people that she was covering. And that was very much sort of passé and not accepted. And yet, as we look back on the various wars she was covering, from World War II all the way through Vietnam, we learn so much more and we understand so much more deeply if we are able to have empathy with those who were on the ground fighting or the civilians who were caught in the crossfire. And Dickey really did that in her journalism. So I absolutely wanted to convey that throughout my book, and particularly set the stage for the book in that way, in the introduction, that lovely passage you just read. So thank you for picking that out and for reminding me a bit of, of the gravity of Dickey's story. So thank you.
So I think for me, the emotion of that is around the bigger picture that, like you've just shared, how at the time, she was trailblazing in many, many ways. And also having read the book cover to cover very quickly, I couldn't put it down. Dickey's fortitude. She did not give up. She held her vision of what she knew she was on this planet to do, and she went for it
Yeah.
against every odd.
Yes, yes, that's absolutely true. It is hard to describe all the things that she overcame to reach her vision. And I will also say this, I took a lot of it out of the book because I think rightfully so, my editor said, this is, people aren't going to want to read through all these downs. It's too much. I should also say that the first draft of the book that I delivered was twice as long as as the final one. And it's a tome, it's, what is it, 400 pages long. But I wanted readers, and particularly women, to see that she, despite her ultimate success in achieving her goals, she had, I don't want to say she failed, but there were so many mini failures, right? That she had to overcome, in addition to all the sexism and prejudice that she also had to deal with. But yeah, she had this sort of preternatural driving force behind her. And that was true. She was very strong-willed, since she was a child. She knew what she wanted to do and how she wanted to do it from a very young age. But, spoiler alert, she was a prisoner of war while covering the Hungarian, uprising in 1957, 1956, 1957. And she came out of that prison, in that communist prison, with a new kind of zeal, sort of burning inside her, that would not let her rest, that would not let her sit still, that compelled her to cover other people's struggles for freedom. I think very much because she had a visceral experience of not being free in a way that very few Americans can or ever will experience. So yeah, I think that drive that you mentioned was extraordinary and unique.
Yeah, I also wonder how, knowing what her home life was like, that sense of maybe entrapment that she also felt potentially. You can speak better to this than I can through your close work with her life story. But she also experienced the opposite of freedom in that way. Would you say that's accurate?
I would say that's absolutely accurate. And so just to preface it a little bit, her husband, who was not really her husband because he was already married, and he didn't get really divorced because he got divorced in Mexico, but it didn't matter in the United States. So they were never really married, which was its own problem, and on and on. But he was, I think if I were going to diagnose him as a layman, he had borderline personality disorder, and he was very manipulative and very psychologically abusive. And they were married, they got married when she was 19 and he was in his mid 40s. And he really wanted to have a young woman that he could shape into the mold of a partner that he wanted. But she had this sort of undeniable drive to be herself inside of her. And so even though she was sort of ensnared in his psychological web for 15 years, she could never totally relinquish herself. And I'm not going to get the dates wrong. I believe that, no, I am going to get the dates correctly. They were married in 1939, 1941, just before Pearl Harbor, and they divorced in 1955. She was then taken prisoner by the Hungarian secret police on Pearl Harbor Day, 1956. And, you know, I do think she was held in solitary confinement for the better part of 6 weeks. And I do think her training in dealing with the psychological warfare waged on her by her own husband for so many years helped her withstand that psychological warfare and torture inflicted on her by her jailers. I think that's an unfortunate truth. And I'm not going to comment on the, silver lining of it, but thank God she was able to survive all of it so that we have the stories that she brought back from that time, from before that time, and then from moving on to what I would say was the sort of pinnacle of her career in the early Cold War, going into these, limited wars in smaller countries fighting for their independence, whether that was from communism or Western imperialism.
Wow. So she is a classic example of somebody who endured the archetype, the classic archetypal example of someone who endured traumas and turned them into an asset.
Yes, exactly. Well put. Totally. And I also have to say, since you mentioned that, I tried to write this book and also my book that I just finished on Jeanette Rankin, who's the first woman to be elected to Congress in 1916. I try to write them in that way as heroes' journeys, right? Because I find so rarely in fiction or nonfiction about women do we get to experience this hero's journey where it's okay to fail, it's okay to be traumatized, it's okay to grow, it's okay to change. In fact, these are, as you said, the things that allow us to thrive and succeed. We are not born perfect. We become ourselves as we move through life, and that is the hero's journey. So yeah, I definitely wanted Dickey's story, which, I mean, come on, she's in Hades, and in prison. Like, how more clear could it be to reflect that sort of storytelling arc?
That's amazing. Well, you did such a beautiful job. It's such a compelling story, and we dove right into the meat of it. Yeah, which is so typical of me. But I wonder if the people who are viewing, if it would benefit them to have like your broad overview of Dickey's sort of chronology of life in terms of her contributions as a photojournalist.
Sure. Yeah. So I love to start with her sort of teenage years, just to say she was born in 1918. She sort of had this classic Midwestern upbringing. She was from a little town outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And even the Great Depression, her father was employed for the entire time. Her mother was a stay-at-home mom. She lived with her grandparents. It was a very stable environment. Even so, she was always sort of extraordinary and had this real sense of patriotism. She would famously salute the flag on the way to her elementary school. She would just like stop and salute the flag every morning, which I love. But when she became a teenager, she became very interested in aeronautics, and she really wanted to be a pilot. And she told her mom that she wanted to be a pilot, and her mother, being sort of a Midwestern worrywart, was like, no, you're never going to be a pilot, which, this was like 1933. planes were not pressurized. They were basically flying tin cans. Like, they were very dangerous. One could understand why her mom didn't want her to do this. So, well, in addition to being very much her own spirit, Dickey was also brilliant. She graduated her high school as valedictorian at 16, got into MIT in the aeronautical engineering program as one of only 3 women admitted that year in 1934. But she failed. She flunked out soon after arriving because she just wanted to spend all of her time at the airfields watching the planes, learning how they fly rather than sketching them out on a blackboard. And it really sort of, her fate really was sealed when there was a big flood in the town of Worcester, or rather the city of Worcester in Massachusetts. And the only way to deliver food was through airdrop. And this will be interesting to you because that operation was used as a really basis for the Berlin airdrop later on. In any case, she talked her way aboard a plane in order to cover the story for a local magazine. And this was the first time she had flown, and she never wanted to go back. So she gets home, she flunks out of MIT, she goes home. It's the Great Depression, and she has to get a job. So she gets a job at a flying circus. And she proceeds to learn how to fly and take part of her, salary in flying lessons. She then goes to Miami to live with her grandparents for a while, where she also gets a job at a flying circus. And eventually, sort of by serendipity, she attracts the attention of the head of promotion at TWA, right? The Howard Hughes's groundbreaking airline. And he hires her sort of on spec, and she moves to New York City. And she's exposed to so much more in New York City, right? And it's here where she's working at TWA, where she's in Times Square, and she sees the ticker tape news on September 1st, 1939, that Hitler has invaded Poland. And so now she's got this flying experience, she's got this PR experience, and she's got this real sense that she wants to be at the center of things. And so she knows the world is about to shift. And she's already written for a couple magazines, but she really starts focusing on her journalism and starts taking photography classes because she thinks, okay, I'm a woman. She's realistic. She knows that a lot of papers and magazines aren't going to want to hire a woman to report unless they can bring something extra. So she's like, I can write, but if I can also be a photojournalist, then I'll be, this triple threat. So she takes photography classes from the man who ends up being her husband, Tony Chapelle, from whom she takes her name. Oh, and I forgot to mention, she was born as Georgette Louise Meyer, and Dickey is a name that she took in honor of Admiral Richard Byrd, who was himself a war hero and also the first person to fly over the North Pole. In any case, speaking of long-winded, so she's able to cover a couple stories at the beginning of the war, but again, the combination of the lack of support from her husband and the sexism she's facing from both the military, at the time, women were not allowed to cover combat. They had to be where women were already, which meant nurses. She was really covering stories from the rear and then also writing, sort of propaganda books for the US government, encouraging women to go into the aeronautical fields, something that she was particularly, capable of doing. But in 1945, she gets her chance. And because she can only be where women are, she talks her way aboard a hospital ship on its way to Iwo Jima, right? So she's with nurses, but she's really going to be close to the front. And she ends up then talking her way aboard a medevac plane that lands on Iwo Jima. And then she talks her way on sort of outside of military protocol. She talks her way, she talks her way aboard an artillery vehicle going to the front. And in this way, from my research, my understanding, she becomes the first woman at the front of the Pacific Theater. She does this again on Iwo Jima, or rather on Okinawa, where she's able to be embedded for a week with the Marines there and covering particularly the field hospitals in that area during that operation. And she did a lot of wonderful groundbreaking work. She was also with the fleet on April, I believe, 17th, which was the first and the most intense kamikaze attack during the Okinawa campaign. I'm pretty sure, I'm pretty confident about that date. But if I'm wrong, correct me. But then when she got back to the United States and the war ended, like so many other women, she was sort of forced out of her career of choice. She did get a job with 17 magazine, which at the time was and is now, Go 17, a wonderful magazine, really empowering young women. But that wasn't her passion and her purpose. But it turns out that one of the founders of the magazine was a Quaker, and the Quakers were doing a lot of important work in post-war Europe. And I mean, Erin, I don't know about you, but before really diving into this research, I always thought, okay, war ended, Marshall Plan, Europe, great, yay. But that's not the case. I mean, it wasn't until what, 1949 or what, no, 1947 that the Marshall Plan passed. And so you have 2 years where small secular and non-secular organizations are trying to shore up and rebuild Europe. And Dickey spent months at a time documenting this and really getting a sense of empathy and deep understanding of what these people were going through in a way I would argue that most Western journalists, most American journalists, and even I think a lot of European journalists didn't experience, because they didn't go into the bomb shelters where people were living. They didn't, wait in line with the children lined up on the banks of the, Volga, like waiting for their one meal of a day. And so she carried this sense of empathy and understanding with her through the rest of her career. And this combined with her aforementioned experience of being in a communist prison really set her apart. And so then we get into the meat of her of her experience, and I'll sort of breeze through, and then you can go back and ask whatever questions you want. But she was the first woman embedded with the Algerian Liberation Front. She called their fight for independence Jeffersonian. She compared them to our own American revolutionaries. She marched through the Sierra Maestra Mountains with Castro, the Cuban Revolutionary Army. She was embedded with special forces in Laos in like 1961. She marched with the Sea Swallows, anti-Chinese guerrilla army in the Mekong Delta. She jumped with the South Vietnamese airborne like 13 times or something absolutely, mind-blowing. So her whole life, right, primed her to have a holistic understanding of these proxy wars that very much defined the Cold War. And so what I really, just to sort of bookend my long soliloquy here, what I really wanted to do with this book was not only tell Dickey Chapelle's story, but also tell the story of like a people's history of the Cold War, which was really I think the driving force behind her own journalism.
It's what an incredible life she had. I mean, just listening to you say this, I'm in awe yet again by how she didn't miss a beat in spite of having to be at home making Tony's spaghetti or whatever was going on there. I mean, right? She had bouts of that where she was tending to the domestic duties, and she's still
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the other thing about Tony was that he was an alcoholic and progressed into drug addiction, and she became, his nurse, his psychologist, his career advisor, his, financial advisor. She was the bread earner. She just had so much weight on her shoulders. And then, I really wanted to talk about that in my book, because I'm not saying like, oh, ladies, dump your men. Without them, you could be whatever you want. 'Cause I'm married, I have 2 kids, I'm happy. But I think a lot of us have been in relationships where we are expected to be all of these things and also achieve our goals and dreams. And once Dickey left this non-supportive environment, she was able to excel. And that's something that I did want to communicate in this book, not from my own personal agenda, but because she herself said, she was asked, can you be a wife and I believe foreign correspondent? And she said, yes, but not at the same time. And so she was really fully and wholly committed to her work.
Yeah, I think it's a testimony to commitment, and also to, I think, no matter what our life story is, no matter what our experiences have been at some point in our lives, whether male or female, young person or older person, we've experienced unsupportive environments. And I think that's just a part of life. And I think, like, I try to share with my daughter that life is going to throw things at you, and what matters is how you are with that. It's
Yeah.
not what that thing is or what that person, you perceive that person is doing. It's about sticking with who you are and sticking with your commitments you've made to yourself, and being with life in a way that increases strength, and you don't capitulate to unsupportive environments. So I think,
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think so often, I mean, it has been my experience in researching Dickey. I see it happening to her, but people ask things of us. And so often, I would say women are sort of socialized just to say yes and to give. But just because we are asked does not mean we have to give. We have the power of no. Um, and I think that was really, a turning point in Dickey's life when she had left Tony and he was really trying to get her to come back. And she just had to say no, 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 no over and over again. But what she's really saying is yes to herself. And as soon as she started saying yes to herself, that's when other people also started saying yes to her. So I talked a little bit about this in the book, but you might be interested in this because you're the daughter of a Vietnam War veteran, if I'm correct. In 1955, right after she had left Tony, she wanted to put a continent between them. And she met with the commandant of the Marine Corps, and they were just starting to develop helicopter warfare tactics. And she went to Camp Pendleton to report on this. Now, her work was never published for a variety of reasons that we can or not get into later, but she documented that sort of nascent moment of helicopter warfare. And right, when did she really do her best work? In Vietnam, because she understood with more clarity, I would argue, than anyone else, the power and also the limitations of helicopter warfare. So, so that is just to go back to just to sort of tie it into the other conversation, right? She said no to Tony. She asked, because she had said no, she was able to ask the Marines for this ability to go be at Camp Pendleton, and they said yes. But if she had kept saying yes to Tony, I will be your nursemaid, I will be your breadwinner, I will be this, she would never have gotten that other yes. So what yes does she really want? What yes do we really want? And yeah, I think, you know, I'll just finish this sort of thought, but being a woman's historian, right? I'm always fascinated at that moment of that switch. When do these extraordinary women start saying yes to themselves? And what happens after that? Because there's always that moment. So yeah.
Yeah, it's real. I have chills.
Yeah.
From the it's so true. And I think because of the conditioning in our society as women, as you already said, there is that yes, yes, yes factor. But when you turn it on to yourself and say yes to yourself, as a man too, men have their own,
Absolutely.
versions of conditioning, right? And
Oh,
there
yeah.
are things about themselves they need to say yes to. So it's, it's really about, that's that fortitude that I mentioned about Dickey, right? We all have that in our own ways if we choose to listen to it, saying yes to yourself, yes to yourself, yes to yourself. That's what gives you the fortitude and the drive and the motivation to keep going forward and listening. It's about listening to who you are, why you're here, and relentlessly pursuing it.
Relentlessly pursuing it. And I would also say it's like a muscle or just a skill that you have to work at, like elevating and amplifying that voice inside of us so that we can hear it in those moments where maybe everything else is very loud, right? That's the most important time to be able to listen, to be able to hear your internal voice, is when everything else is screaming at you.
Yeah. Tuning it all out except for the still small voice inside, right?
Exactly.
Or maybe it's the loud, raw, I've had enough
Guttural
voice.
scream.
Yeah, exactly. I think that voice shows up in all kinds of ways. Oh
Yes,
my gosh,
absolutely.
so many things you said. It's funny, one of my questions for you is going to be, how many drafts did you write and how long was your first draft? As a writer, I understand that process.
Okay,
And
I'll tell you, Erin, I'll talk about this all day long. So many drafts. So like, I have this picture, I should favorite it on my phone because it is my first draft. And I just have this page and I've crossed out every single word on the page. And that didn't happen one time. That was many, many, many pages. And so much of this book was rewriting And so I'll kind of back up to tell the more larger picture. So I got this, I put the pitch together before COVID. I got my agent when I was just pregnant with my first son. We put the pitch together, we sent it out. I had my baby January 3rd, 2020. Okay. Then COVID happens. 6 months later, my first of the front sells. Okay. So I have a 6 months old. I have my first book ever. And I'm going to be honest, like, I'd never written a book before. I didn't know how to write a book. I have a baby. I never had a baby before. I didn't know how to be a mom. Like, so I'm breastfeeding, and like editing my book on my phone, just like stealing moments whenever I can. Thank God my husband is a very, very supportive partner. My mom was a great grandmother. My stepfather was really, great with the kid at that time. And I had a lot of support, but it was just so much and so hard. And yeah, writing this book was really about rewriting it constantly. And so I can't tell you how many times I read the whole book through, edited it, and before I even sent it, to my editor at St. Martin's. Then, because it was so long, the book was so long, we had a lot of back and forths, and she is a saint for, really sculpting the narrative into what it became. I'm so grateful for her, and her vision, and her willingness to like go there with me. So yeah, it was a long process. But what's interesting is that I just finished the first draft of my second book, and that was a totally different experience. Like, first of all, I had 1 year to research it and write it, which is very different. Like, I had already written 3 chapters of the book for the book pitch. I outlined everything. I'd done a lot of the research, on and on and on. This book, it was like, okay, start date July 15th, end date July 15th. You better get it or too bad. But at the same time, having done it once, I was really able to sort of be more direct in what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say it. So I guess this is just for like, other writers out there. Your first book is the hardest. And then, it's not like you're going to cruise or whatever, but it does, as with all things, get easier, the second time around.
Wow, that's so amazing. I had no idea you wrote Dickey's book with basically a brand new baby.
Brand
And
new baby.
here in this, your own version of Fortitude, and listening to your voice and pursuing and pursuing and pursuing, because that in and of itself is amazing while the whole world is shut down. Right?
It was,
Because it was
it was a
2020.
lot. And I that time was so many different things to so many different people. But for me, and my family, first of all, it like brought my extended family together, in a way that I had not expected. We're so much closer now than we ever had been. And, we all share each other's visions and goals and support each other in a way that I think is very rare, and that I'm just so grateful for, because I couldn't have done it without them. And just being in that kind of proximity under that kind of pressure for that amount of time, can be bad and is difficult regardless, but can also just be a bit, there can be great things that come out of it too.
Yeah, and I would dare say, I'm going to guess, I'm going to speak for you. You tell me if I'm wrong, that you may have hit a sense of like peak exhilaration around your ability to accomplish something in the middle of, I mean, wow, that's just some big life moments, and you did it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. And also writing about Dickey and seeing her fortitude and her bravery was really quite inspiring. I do try to stay, as a biographer, you want to be, okay, I'll say it like this. My approach is to be their good friend, right? And a good friend is not someone who is constantly saying, this is okay, that's fine, you're doing great. It's to accurately assess how they are doing. Because that's what you want from your friends. When you're like going off, when you're not listening to your inner voice, when you're letting other people walk all over you, you want your friend there to tell you the truth and to shore you up. And so I try to be very honest in my assessment about her. And there are moments in the book where I'm a bit critical of her coverage or her choices or what have you. But overall, writing about her in this very difficult period of time when journalists in particular were more important than ever before, and then also having to draw on my own inner strength and rely on everyone around me was, as you said, a really formative moment in my life. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there could be no greater inspiration than Dickey's story. I mean, this is a woman who's literally on Iwo Jima with the Marine Corps.
I know.
One of the like most horrific experiences in warfare happened on Iwo Jima. My great grandfather was there, actually.
Oh, wow. Oh my God.
Yeah. So she's there. Not only is she there in the middle of this horribleness that's happening all around, she's a woman
Yeah.
who's there when women aren't supposed to be there. She gets herself there. That alone of her whole story is just so astounding to me.
Yeah.
Because that sort of environment, oh my goodness, I mean, it's no joke. So that one instance in Dickey's life and career of many, many inspiring instances, like how could a person not be completely inspired to push themselves to the absolute limits of their best possible achievement ever, holding Dickey's story in their hand like that? Like,
Yeah,
she's
absolutely.
amazing guide, right?
She is, yes. And I just, no shade on Martha Gellhorn or Margaret Burke White or anything, but Dickey did what they did in World War II and then went on. And God knows, I'm like, yes, like let's get more of those women's stories too. But how is it that we don't have Dickey's story more at the forefront and as an inspiration, for all women, but particular for women like journalists and combat journalists, like both as just inspiration and as not the end all be all, but a foundation to talk about empathetic journalism, right? Because that's another thing that was really important in my book is this idea where a lot of times both journalists and I'm not like being mean to anybody, but both journalists and nonprofits, they'll just sort of parachute into situations and think that because of their privilege they understand what's going on and they understand the solution and they understand the story and that they don't need to listen or take anything in to do their job. And Dickey was the opposite of that. She really understood that if she were going to tell the stories of these men who were fighting and the men and women and children who were, and oftentimes the women who were fighting and the people who were caught in the crossfire, that she had to actually listen to their stories. And one instance that I can't remember if it made it into the book, but I just found so touching was when she was really embedded with the South Vietnamese airborne. After one particular mission, she took all of her, unit and their wives out to dinner. And they didn't speak a lot of English, and she didn't speak any Vietnamese. But she wrote to a friend something to the effect of, who needs a language in common when you have camaraderie? And that's really how she approached the people with whom she interacted, was we have a shared humanity. And that's the most important thing. Everything else is tangential, but we have this unbreakable connection. Yeah, I've been so grateful that a lot of people, and particularly women and women like in your field who are storytellers, find resonance with that side of her practice.
Yeah, I'm amazed, to echo your earlier words, that she's not more in the forefront. I was amazed that I have never heard of this woman. I actually told my daughter all about her, the boring mom lecture on the way to school this morning. She's like, "What are you doing today, Mom?" And I said, "Well," and I told her, and she was like, "Okay, wow, that's really cool. That lady's amazing. I can't imagine." And that's the truth of it. That's the absolute truth. Even if you strip away like the home life complexities
Yeah.
that Dickey was dealing with, like her actual contribution to this planet was immense and it spanned decades. And I don't understand why her work isn't more widely known. I am so grateful to you for telling her, for writing this book so I could learn. Dickey's story has inspired me in huge ways. And I could talk to you for hours about this,
I
but
know.
I'm aware the time is like slipping away from my fingers right now, through my fingers. I have a couple questions that are smaller, but I have another question that I'd really love to know the answer to. And this is like kind of backwards. I should have asked you this at the beginning, but how did you find Dickey?
So that's a great question. And I actually like answering this later. So I'm glad you're asking it later. So I learned about Dickey Chapelle in high school. And I don't know if you know her, but there's this wonderful folk musician by the name of Nancy Griffith.
I do know Nancy Griffith.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so she has a song called A Pearl's Eye View, all about this female journalist who would fly in planes and jump out of them and do anything to, get the story. And her name is Dickey Chapelle. And, I bought the CD because I'm old in high school with my tip money, from my weekend job. And I love this song and I love the album. It's her album, A Clock Without Hands, which is sort of, her most celebrated album. And I listened to it all the time. And she really became like a folk hero in a way that, John Henry or Paul Bunyan or Annie Oakley is a folk hero. And I didn't think about her as a real person, but she, in many ways, especially as I went off to college, was a role model, right? Like this fearless woman who would tell the truth no matter what and find the story, no matter how deep she had to dig. And, like life went on and I, worked in the arts for a long time in New York and then just sort of had my meandering career, like, 20s as one does. But in 2016, I decided that if I was going to be a writer, which had always been my dream, but one that I had never believed myself capable of achieving, actually, that if I was going to do this, then I better do it now. And so I went back to school. I got my master's degree at NYU, and I did my master's thesis on something you might be interested in, which were the audio letters of American GIs.
Oh,
They would
wow.
record, on cassette tape largely and send home. And I want to turn that into a book too. But in any case, in my research, Dickey Chapelle's name came up again. And I hadn't thought about her in years. I thought, oh, well, great. I need a book, to read. I'm just going to Google her and I'll probably find a couple documentaries and books and so on and so forth. And I didn't find much of anything. There was a biography written about her 30 some years ago that was out of print that I did read that I don't feel really was accurately captured the totality of Dickey Chapelle, which is fine. That's true of a lot of first biographies. And I wrote an article about her for Narratively magazine, Narratively, which is a great like online publication. And from that, I developed the book idea with my agent, and then we sent it off, and then St. Martin's Press like bought it pretty quickly thereafter. So again, it was, there are some things in our lives that seem so strangely yet so perfectly fated, right? That she was an influence on me, that I knew her. I was one of the few people to know about her, and that I went on this long journey that really helped me understand her story, and then that I was able to write her biography. So it was it was like almost a spiritual practice of writing this book. And I talk about it, and I don't find a lot of other biographers talk about it in these terms, but I can't imagine that they don't think about it in these terms.
Yeah, I agree. I think when you are deeply immersed in a character or a person,
person,
even
yeah.
if it's a fictional character, I
Absolutely,
guess,
absolutely.
you can't help. I mean, if you're going to produce a good work about them, you have to know them intimately. And
Yeah.
something in you opens up and is able to tap into something special, I would guess.
That's how I feel. I mean, I'm often I often use, Ben Kingsley, the actor. Um, he says when he's preparing for a script, preparing for a role, he'll just read the script over and over and over until he really embodies that story and that character. And in the same way, in both my biography of Dickey and my biography of Jeanette Rankin, before I even start writing, I touch, well, fingers to keyboard, I read everything that they've ever written, that has ever been written about them, so that I have in my mind their universe and their life in a way that I can just sort of, you know, really 360 see where they are. And then I also do a lot of, tangential research like with this book, having lived in New York City for such a long time was very helpful in painting her commute from her house to the IRC, or from living in Murray Hill, or, the Upper West Side. But just really being able to describe the landscapes in which they find themselves in, um, is almost as important to me as other historical components, right? Because our geography is also our historical context of our lives.
So I have so many questions for you, but I think we should just do this again and do a part 2. And that's very exciting thought to me. So we'll communicate about that.
Love it.
But I think I have like 2 really silly questions, and then maybe not silly, but easy to answer questions. And my final question before those 2 questions is,
Mhm.
what do you want the big takeaway to be from your effort to tell Dickey's incredible story? What do you want all of us who read her story to take away?
So I want all of us to understand that our freedoms are not guaranteed, that we are rare, that our experience of being free is rare and valuable and fragile. And Dickey understood that, and she spent her life documenting the fight for freedom. And she also understood that the best way to preserve and to bolster and to strengthen freedom is through solidarity, a fierce solidarity with all those who would fight for freedom. And so, in this moment where we are all deciding what freedom means and how we are to be free, I look to a lot of people who do not look like me to be my brothers and sisters in this moment of our new fight for freedom. And that's what I want people to take away from First to the Front.
It's powerful, powerful words, and quite a powerful legacy that Dickey has left us and that you have gifted to us through your work. So huge, huge thank you for that reminder and for your incredible story that you have given us. Everybody needs to buy it. And then my final 2 questions: when is the unabridged version coming out?
I don't know if you want the unabridged version. I like dive so deep into like random, like she was looking at this ship that in France that was like a transport ship, but before that it was a cruise liner, and then it was repurposed in World War I as a hospital ship, but then in World War II it was, troop transport. But then now it's getting retrofitted in, Le Havre, where it's going to be used to deliver tractors, and just like so granular. And I'm like, who doesn't want to know this? And my editor is like, no one wants to know this.
I really love your editor already, but I promise you, I want to know.
I know you do. I know you do.
We're soulmates with it sounds like Rabbit Hole Central. Like,
So rabbit hole, so
I
far
love it.
down.
I think I've got a section like that in a story I'm telling, all about the shit.
Oh my
So I
God.
get it. And then is there going to be a movie?
So, I guess I'll answer this in all seriousness. The I want it to be a movie. I am definitely, me and my agent and my, film agent are trying to make it into a movie. But I think a lot of times, and this is to writers out there, who are listening, when we write a book and we think it's a great story and it should be a movie, that might be true. But the reality of this book is that it's a non-ensemble period piece film. Okay, so what that means is that there's one star. There's a woman who would play her, like, I don't know, Kate Blanchett, if you're listening, check it out. And then there's not like a cast of supporting characters. There's no one for Timothy Chalamet to play or whatever. And period pieces are particularly expensive to make. And so if you don't have a lot of star power around it, it's extra hard to make. That being said, I am really trying to use and find any opportunity to get this in front of people who do make films, because I do think it is particularly a poignant story now in this current historical juncture that we find ourselves in, on so many different levels, on racial equality and solidarity, on gender parity, on women in politics, on truth in journalism. Like, it just hits on every level, and I love it as a book. I'm happy it's a book. I will be forever grateful if it is just a book, but I would love for this to reach for Dickey Chapelle's story to reach a mass audience, because I really believe that her story can and will impact so many lives in a positive way, and is a vision, is a piece of a vision for a future I think we would all like to inhabit, in which we all have a greater sense of empathy, and solidarity with one another. So yeah, like the last thing I would say to fellow writers who are listening, don't give up on your vision. Just because it doesn't happen right away doesn't mean it's not going to happen. And be creative in how you connect with the people who can potentially make your vision happen, and don't be afraid. I'm like totally commenting on the women, who I want to star in it, like on their Instagram posts. I'm so stalking Reese Witherspoon and her Hello Sunshine. Like, you just have to make it happen for yourself if it's going to happen, just like Dickey Chapelle did.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Lorissa. And I am going to, in the video, I'm going to put all of your links down in the text, the description below the video, so people can find you. But your Instagram is Lorissa, is it Lorissa.Rinehart, or just
I think
Lorissa
like under the underscore thing.
underscore thing, Lorissa underscore Rinehart?
Yeah. Yes.
And your TED Talk, which we didn't get a chance to talk about, which like sent me to the heavens. People need to watch it as well. So all of that. Also the book, read the book, buy the book, and maybe we'll have a part 2, and thank you.
I hope so. I hope so. Well, thank you so much, Erin, for having me on. This was just such a pleasure to talk to you and to get to talk about Dickey Chapelle and, the power of of our truth and of saying yes to ourselves and of finding our, four mothers that can help guide and us on our own mission and purpose in life.